Hi gang, the Star Child is a concept that's seen a bit of a resurgence in Warhammer 40k in recent years. An idea from the very first edition of 40k that a lot of people had thought discarded, removed from the game by omission for decades. The immortal form of the Emperor of Mankind, hidden in the warp and awaiting its inevitable rebirth into reality. But the Star Child and its related concepts, the Sensei and the Illuminati, weren't just throwaway plot devices brought back to trigger the nostalgia of old gamers like me. They made up the very first meta-narrative of 40k, an urgent and developing storyline that persisted throughout the early editions until the changing nature of the business of Warhammer forced them out of the spotlight. Want to hear about these videos faster? Well, use your goblin hand to like and subscribe. Thanks. In modern Warhammer 40k, we're quite familiar with the idea of the meta-narrative. In fact, beyond the tabletop battles or the events of the novels, there are always a few of them going on at once. The Indomitus Crusade, the return of the Silent King, the attacks by various hive fleets, or the spheres of expansion of the Tau Empire. All of these are plots in 40k, but they evolve in really big, slow ways so that all the smaller plots of the books and the battles can take place within them. They only update every few years. But Rogue Trader, the very first edition of 40k, released back in the 80s, had its equivalent, a meta-narrative direction for the game that evolved over the setting's first couple of years, a narrative that featured a deliberately nebulous concept, the Star Child. And the Star Child has got a lot of coverage recently because after being mostly ignored for a few decades, it's popped back up in 40k. But it's worth going into exactly what it is and how that idea evolved, because the original Star Child lore wasn't just a one-off concept from a single book. Along with a few other lost elements, the Sensei, the Illuminati, it was part of a big interconnected system of events, factions and conspiracies that provided the background for much of the Rogue Trader era of 40k. So, forget your modern lore, your old ones, your War in Heaven, your Tau and your Necrons. No, in order to explain all this, we need to go back to the very dawn of 40k's in-universe history, which, as it turned out, was only a few thousand years ago. The original Rogue Trader book, published in 1987, was quite light on in-world history. It described the realm of the God Emperor of Mankind and how the galaxy worked in the 41st millennium, but it was pretty minimal with regard to how it got that way. And initial expansions, mostly printed as White Dwarf articles, added rules and background for specific models or armies. The wider context of the galaxy was sort of ignored. That was until the Realm of Chaos books were released. Slaves to Darkness, released in 1989, and The Lost and the Damned, released in 1990, were massive sourcebooks for both Warhammer Fantasy and, to a lesser degree, 40k, that expanded upon the powers of chaos and their followers, providing everything from lore to army lists to even their own self-contained minigames. And one of the big things those two books added to 40k was backstory. It's in these books that the story of the Horus heresy, the Primarchs, and the role of the Emperor were first described in any detail, sometimes actually changing in the year between the two books as the ideas were refined further and further. And it's in these books that we find almost everything we know about the Star Child. But in order to explain that, we first need to explain the Emperor and what exactly Rogue Trader said he was, beginning with his birth on prehistoric Terra as a response to changes in the warp. In the lore of Realms of Chaos, the warp was once a peaceful place, and the energy of the Sea of Souls flowed through every living thing, harmonious and unifying like the Force in Star Wars. At least that's how the warp had worked for all time until the rise of numerous sentient species, including mankind. While the natural energy of the warp was harmonious, the souls of men were often troubled, obsessive, guilt-ridden, or otherwise imperfect, and these negative energies, power, ambition, greed, congregated together in the warp and eventually awoke, becoming the very first powers of chaos. And this made the warp a dangerous place for humanity's first guides, the shaman. There had always been some humans with sensitivity to the warp, known by various names, but here referred to as tribal shaman. And those early psychers guided humanity by reincarnating. When they died, their souls swam free in the energy of the warp before being reborn into a new body soon after. But with the waking of the warp, this guidance was threatened. The souls of the shaman were no longer safe. Not only were they finding it more difficult to tap into the energies of the warp, but the Imperium was now full of demons who hunted and consumed the souls of the shaman before they had time to reincarnate. Meeting in a great debate, the shaman realized that they were doomed. They couldn't individually resist the new demons of chaos, and without their guidance, mankind would be doomed, easy prey for the psychic entities within the warp. In fact, with the warp so disrupted, all of creation was doomed. And so, seeing no other option, they decided to pool their energies and create a being that could resist the creatures of the warp by reincarnating together in a single body. The assembled shaman of humanity in their thousands swallowed poison, releasing their souls to create the new man. It should be said that while this description almost entirely concerns humanity, the fall of the Eldar is also told in broadly the same terms. The Eldar were once a technologically advanced species who ruled the galaxy, but their continued use of warp gates to connect their empire, a technology they learned from the Slann, exposed them to the powers of chaos, which then corrupted them until much of the Eldar empire perished in a psychic orgy that created the chaos god Slaanesh. Now, in modern 40k, the rise and domination of the Eldar, in fact, the existence of the Chaos Gods and the waking of the Warp, happened over millions and millions of years, but in Realms of Chaos, that timeline's a lot shorter. It's all still happening, but the fall of the Eldar's happening roughly at the same time as the birth and rise of humanity. The Eldar just got there a couple of thousand years earlier. Anyway, to avoid that fate, the shaman unify their energies and create the new man, an immortal being that would become the emperor in around 8000 BC in central Anatolia. And from there, the story continues in much the same way as we're used to. The Emperor, armed with the powers and memories of all those psychers, but way more powerful than any individual one of them, guides humanity from the shadows, steering it upon a narrow path only he can see, until eventually humanity takes to the stars. And while that's happening, the Eldar reach the height of their powers, the warp storms isolate humanity, the Eldar fall, and the birth pangs of Slaanesh clear the warp, and when that happens, the Emperor finally emerges, intending to unite humanity through a great crusade, and creates the Primarchs and the Space Marines. But chaos corrupts some of the Primarchs, the Horus heresy happens, and the Emperor has to duel Horus on his battle barge, killing him, but becoming seriously injured in the process and sitting on the Golden Throne. That's the plot of 40k we all know and love. It's all pretty familiar, with the big change that the timeline is very, very compressed. The powers of chaos, Khorne, Tzeentch and Nurgle, apparently only came into full sentience in the Middle Ages, which has not been directly contradicted, but sort of implied that that's a lot longer now. There are smaller things. The Horus heresy in Lost and the Damned is a rebellion by the traitor General Horus, but by the second book, that's fleshed out and he's a Primarch now. But broadly, for our purposes, that is our background. The bedrock on which can be built the setting of 40k and the conflict between the Star Child, the Sensei, and the Illuminati. Let's start with the Star Child. When the Emperor fought Horus at the end of the heresy, he was at a disadvantage. This was because the Emperor was still a human, whereas Horus had shed the last vestiges of humanity and had no pity or friendship left. In order to gain the power to defeat Horus, the Emperor had to channel vast amounts of warp energy, way more than he'd ever done before, and doing this would basically kill him. The Emperor had overextended his power, for no man of living flesh could act as the vessel for so much power and survive. The charred husk of the Emperor fell to the ground amidst a pall of smoke and darkness. That charred husk, all that remained after the duel with Horus, still sort of animated and initially still able to talk, became the Emperor the people of 40k know, the shriveled, mummy-like thing on the Golden Throne, his cells still suffused with psychic power, to all purposes dead, but also still somehow persisting with some amount of life, an amount that shrinks every year. But the Emperor's soul was cast adrift into the warp. Much of his colossal psychic energy was lost, dispersed into the ether of the warp, but a tiny core of his humanity survived, hidden from the forces of chaos like a small child bobbing upon the tide of a colossal storm in a tiny reed boat. Like the shaman of old, the Emperor's soul had returned to a being of potential, awaiting rebirth, and this is called the Star Child, the Numen, the god part of the new man. The immortal soul of the Emperor, awaiting some sort of rebirth in the warp, and while that happens, his psychically infused mortal body persists, still trying to hold the Imperium together, to power the Astronomicon, to stay vaguely alive and not fall to chaos. Alive and also dead, though the Imperium don't know that. As far as the Imperium are concerned, the Emperor on the Golden Throne is the Emperor, and anything else is heresy. So are they completely different entities or two sides of the same person? The physical Emperor is described again and again as only technically being alive. His cells have this residual psychic power. But if he dies, what happens to the Star Child? We don't know. There is a link between the two. How much of a link is unclear. There's a lot of questions unanswered in this and seeming contradictions. It's a bit of a weird piece of writing in that it tends to repeat itself from paragraph to paragraph, almost as if it was written as a load of completely separate pieces and then stitched together. But that's the reality of the Emperor and his warp counterpart, the Star Child. What's going to happen to the Star Child forms the central plot point of the sort of meta plot of early 40k. The battle between the Imperium, the Sensei, and the Illuminati. The Sensei are the closest to good guys in all this. The Sensei are the immortal descendants of the Emperor, roving adventurers with special powers who move through the galaxy righting wrongs, protected innately from the powers of chaos and connected to the pure warp, like some sort of 40k Jedi. There's a slight difference in how the two realms of chaos books explain them. In Slaves to Darkness, the Sensei are the direct sons of the Emperor, but all of them are psychic blanks, being completely warp inert. That means that not only can the Emperor not see them and is unaware of their existence, but neither can other psychers, and like blanks in modern 40k, this means they're completely immune to chaos corruption. All of them are descended directly from relationships the Emperor had when he walked the planet, but the Sensei are all infertile, so they can't have kids on their own. Now that's what Slaves to Darkness said, but by the following years Lost in the Dam, that had been rewritten slightly. Now, the Sensei are the descendants of the Emperor's own children, and while not all the descendants of that line inherit the Sensei genes, those that do are stronger, faster, and more intelligent than regular humans, and are a sort of psyker who can manipulate the powers of the warp, but they tap into the pure, untouched power of the warp, not the chaos stuff. They're still completely immune to the powers of chaos or to chaos corruption, but here they're described as embodiments of the Star Child itself. The Corpse Emperor might not know they exist, but the Star Child empowers them just as the Chaos Gods empower their various champions. Sensei have no trace of the damaging emotions that feed chaos. They're calm, confident, unable to experience hate or irrational anger, beings of harmony, at one with the Force, warp. They journey through the galaxy accompanied by bands of followers and comrades, righting injustices, which often brings them into conflict with the Imperium, who they deem as very unjust. The Lost and the Damned even includes rules for playing them. You can assemble a Sensei Adventurer band for use in a Chaos Warband campaign, where the Sensei has the mark of the Star Child, gains rewards of the Star Child, and can even achieve apotheosis, becoming a Sensei Master, which is described much like a Chaos Champion becoming a Demon Prince. The Sensei are then one of the main objectives of our next group, the Illuminati. The Illuminati are a secret society active within the Imperium, a group of individuals united by one common experience. Each of them have been possessed by a demon of the warp, but cast it out by strength of will. They're aware of the terrible nature of the universe they inhabit, aware of the power of chaos, and over the years they've become aware of the Star Child too. Their experience gives them a balance that even the Eldar are in awe of, apparently, and so they're some of the few humans who've been given access to the Black Library in the Webway. Unlike the roving do-gooders that are the Sensei, the Illuminati are much more of a mysterious secret society. They infiltrate the Imperium, even to the point of infiltrating the Inquisition, attempting to manipulate Imperial will to bring about their own objectives, the chief of which is the survival of humanity at any cost, even if that means losing the Emperor entirely or destroying the Imperium. The Imperium, after all, cannot be allowed to fail in the same way the Eldar did, creating yet another warp power like the Eldar did with Slaanesh. And one of the Illuminati's many plots involves the Sensei. The Illuminati search out the Sensei, protecting them and inducting them into a long watch of Sensei Knights, dedicated to protecting humanity and fighting in the last battle against chaos, the final defeat of the malign forces of the warp. They nurture and build up Sensei bands, keeping them close and guiding them as best they can. At least, that's what they tell the Sensei. In reality, the Illuminati are gathering and tracking the Sensei so that eventually, when the Corpse Emperor's will finally breaks, the Illuminati can offer up the Sensei to the Golden Throne en masse, sacrificing them once again to birth the Emperor's soul anew, a merging of the power of the Sensei and the remaining power of the Emperor, or of the Star Child, it's unclear. And of course, the Imperium are only partly aware of this. They consider all of this to be heresy, and the ruling council of the Inquisition, which at this point was the Ordo Malleus, is engaged in a constant war with both the Sensei and the Illuminati. The Sensei they see as weird, immortal mutants, and the Illuminati as a dangerous cult that seeks to destabilize the Imperium. There's even a separate project by the Ordo Malleus called the Eternity Project, dedicated to hunting down these immortal mutants. That whole setting, laid out in the Realms of Chaos books, seems to have been one early attempt to provide the 40k setting with a sort of narrative, a wider plot that the smaller plots of the battles and supplements can fold into. The Emperor on his golden throne, worshipped by the Imperium, is a lie. The true Emperor is the Star Child, empowering his own champions in the fight against chaos, while the Illuminati try and force its hand, one day planning to revive or unite the Emperor again. It's told in a very large-scale mythical way, and then it's called back to in some of the earlier Warhammer novels. The plot of Inquisitor by Ian Watson, the first Warhammer 40k novel, concerns an Illuminati cabal allied to the Eldar operating within the Inquisition. Jack Draco, the protagonist, learns all this stuff while the main antagonist, Jeffro Carnelian, goes through the process of becoming illuminated. Jack Draco even talks directly to the Emperor in the throne room on Terra, who confirms that the warp houses a reflection of his goodness cast out from him during his battle with Horus. It's clear that this is intended to be the big story happening in the background, the real story happening behind all the novels, but after the Rogue Trader era, the entire idea is kind of jettisoned. During the latter parts of Rogue Trader, around 1990-1991, Games Workshop went through some really big changes. There was a management buyout by the then managing director, Tom Kirby, which saw many of the original leaders of Games Workshop leave. Brian Ansell, who had run the studio for years at that point, left with his shares and started his own company, and in the early 90s, the focus shifted to rebranding 40k somewhat as a more consumer-friendly product. The second edition of 40k, which came out soon after, had boxed starter sets, clear factions with their own codex books, and while nothing was officially removed, all of this remained valid, the crazy psychedelic bits of the Rogue Trader era took a back seat while the setting was expanded more formally and in ways more relevant to the tabletop. So while the Star Child Sensei Illuminati plotline was never actually retconned, it just sort of never came up again. None of the factions at play of that were really things you could sell an army book about. But many of the ideas that were introduced in that early story did eventually make their way back into 40k, recycled back into the lore. For example, the idea that the Emperor needs to be born again, his spirit released to the warp, became one of the central ideas behind the Thorians, an inquisitorial faction introduced in the Inquisitor game in 2001. The Inquisitor game pit different warbands of Inquisitors against each other, and therefore it had to come up with reasons why Inquisitors might disagree. These were introduced as inquisitorial philosophies, one of which was the Thorians. These Inquisitors believe that the Emperor can empower mortals, preachers and saints and war leaders, and that those people become divine avatars. And in fact, their goal is to try and find a way in which the entire of the Emperor's power can be reincarnated into a single person. They're considered a loyal Puritan group, and there are various factions of Thorians, each of which believe crazier versions of this. It's even hinted that there are factions who believe that the only way to do this is to kill the Emperor so that he can reincarnate. A plotline that's pretty similar to to the one involving the Illuminati. And the Horus Heresy novels that started to come out in 2006 introduced the Perpetuals, immortal humans who've existed throughout humanity's history, many of whom have some special strange power. Malcador and the Emperor are redefined as Perpetuals, as was Alanius Pius, in the lore the patron saint of the Imperial Guard. Many Perpetuals were well-known historical figures, attempting to guide humanity in some way through the ages, in a way that's very reminiscent of the Sensei, even though they have a different origin story. And then, more recently, the old Starchild lore has been hinted at. The End and the Death by Dan Abnett is the final trilogy in the Siege of Terror series, retelling the story of the fateful duel between Horus and the Emperor, and while the book introduces a lot more detail than there ever was before, the core of the story remains pretty true to the very oldest versions. In The End and the Death, when the Emperor realises that he can't safely draw enough power from the warp to defeat Horus, and that by fighting him he will likely die, we're told that he casts aside a piece of himself. My lord and friend has broken off a part of his soul. He has amputated that portion of himself that contains almost all of his hope, loyalty and compassion, for such things will become a hindrance when he faces the Lupercal. He has set those frail and cardinal virtues adrift on the tides of the Imperium so they will not immobilize him, and in the hope that one day he'll be able to reclaim them and become whole again. All his hope, his mercy, his grace, his love, cast into the lightless tracks of space and time. That excerpt from The End and the Death not only maps pretty closely the original story, it's also very similar to the Starchild. So we now know that in the warp somewhere, at least as of the 31st millennium, there is still a fragment of the Emperor's goodness, whatever the hell that is out there. And then most recently, we get to the Dawn of Fire series, set way later in the end of the 41st millennium, start of the 42nd, during the Indomitus Crusade. First, in Throne of Light, we get the only mention of the Illuminati again in all those years. An appendix states that they were discovered to be a chaos cult and destroyed some years prior to the formation of the Great Rift. That's potentially them officially gotten rid of. Presumably the name was a bit too similar to other things. In the same series, there have been some very vague hints towards Starchildy stuff. In The Gate of Bones, early on in the series, there are rumours of a holy child, rumours which the word bearers take seriously enough to consider it a major threat. And then throughout the series, there are rumours of Emperor-granted visions which concern a golden-eyed child. In fact, some of the characters from the series have those visions. Golden eyes are a reference to the Emperor that's used throughout the Heresy books. None of this should really be taken as any sort of confirmation. Warhammer works in vague rumours and mystery, and so despite all the YouTube videos on the subject, none of this is confirmation that the Starchild still exists or doesn't, or that it's the same thing as it used to be. Just like the Starchild itself, the concept's just floating around out there. A concept from the very earliest days that hasn't completely gone away, and a vague ball of potential that may or may not influence 40k going forward. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to hear more about the old lore of Warhammer, there's probably a video popping up to the right. And of course, if you'd like to support the channel, hey look, there's merch, there's a second channel with Book Club and Tale of Four Gamers, or you can join the Patreon and YouTube membership schemes and get early access to the videos. See ya!